Hey everyone, and welcome to episode 16 of That Gives Me Anxiety, the season 2 finale, which I can't believe we're already here. Alright, let's jump right into it. I haven't finished it yet, but I'm assuming everyone listening to this is already watching Squid Game. It's so deeply disturbing. And yet the whole world seemingly can't look away. Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. But it's also been really fun to have Ted Lasso queued up for right after. You know, you watch one where humanity's breaking down, and then another one where, everyone's really nice to each other. But yeah, Squid Game has been a nice ease into the horror stuff. Jamie and I always watch a ton of horror in October, and there's usually a problem. I buy it. I buy into horror. And so, we're probably going to start watching the latest installment from the director of The Haunting of Hill House. And I'm not going to sleep for 3 weeks. I enjoy it. I enjoy being scared, but I just buy into it. But it's also funny. It's always been funny to me to think that, you watch a show about ghosts and then you start expecting to see ghosts, as if ghosts will only get you if you've recently watched something about ghosts. Like they have this sense of irony. Or maybe it's just opening your eyes to the fact that they exist. That's a little bit of my internal struggle that will be going on from 1 a.m. to 4 a.m. nightly through Thanksgiving. Well, other than preparing myself to be terrified for 4 weeks. Another great weekend down here in Charleston. We went to Lewis Barbecue, which real good stuff. They have this green chili barbecue sauce. I know it sounds weird. It's phenomenal. Had some brisket, some pulled pork, pretty much every side that they had, Because you don't go to a barbecue place looking to avoid gluttony or to have a salad. You're there to pack on some pounds. Winter is coming, You got to get that rib sticking food. Also, let's see, last night, I'm recording this on Monday the 11th, so last night was Sunday. And it was the first, I play in a beer league hockey team, and it was the first game that I didn't feel like I needed to throw up by the first 5 minutes. Hey, look who's getting in shape. Oh, Patty. I work out pretty often, but I don't know. For some reason, I've just been suffering through these games. But yeah, nice to be able to enjoy it and enjoy the exercise as opposed to just being miserable and sucking wind. Well, we've got a great episode here today. It's a bit of a bonus episode, right? We heard pieces of this interview in the episode I did with comedian Josh Krebs and Dr. Christina Pierpaoli Parker. But I also feel like the whole interview provides a lot of value. A lot of people struggle with sleep and struggle with nightmare disorders, which I'm about to go through, Halloween related movies, because I'm also a child. But not to belittle people who have actual nightmare disorders. It's a very real thing. And because of all that, I wanted to put out the whole interview because I think it could really help some people. Like I said, this is the season finale. And after this, I have season 3 ready of my other podcast called Death Space Filling the Void. Show about death, grief, mortality, psychology, physics, and space. So check that out. I've got an incredible 3rd season ready to go. And while that's coming out, I'll start recording season 3 of this podcast. So if you have any ideas or thoughts or notes, I'd love to hear them. I'm really open to suggestions and ways I can make this better. And if you have a fun idea or something that causes you anxiety, let's hear it. Let's make some fun content. As always, if you're liking the show, please remember to rate and review it. Same goes for Death Space Filling the Void. And to check out either show, both shows, on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Thank you so much for listening, and enjoy this interview with Dr. Christina Pierpaoli Parker. Joining me now is Christina Pierpaoli Parker.
Hey, Patrick. I am indeed Christina Pierpaoli Parker. I have my PhD in clinical psychology and right now find myself working as a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, specializing in adult behavioral sleep medicine.
That's great. I'm so excited to have you today because we're going to be talking about nightmares.
Thank you for having me. I hope our conversation is not nightmarish, and forgive me for all of the puns I definitely will insert into our conversation.
Of course. That would be a slight to the podcast if there weren't nightmare puns like that. It's just sitting right there. So tell me a little bit about your background.
Sure. So right now, in my capacity as a postdoctoral fellow at UAB, I have worked to develop an integrated behavioral medicine clinic, which focuses on providing co-located psychiatric and physical health intervention for people struggling with managing or adjusting to chronic illness. So the purpose of the service is to help people to prevent and manage chronic psychiatric and physical health conditions, including but not limited to anxiety, depression, comorbid chronic pain, sleep issues, including insomnia, obstructive sleep apnea, nightmares, as well as metabolic syndrome. And my line of research just broadly focuses on the intersection of psychological and physical health into later life, as well as the development of brief behavioral interventions for preventing and managing those chronic illnesses.
You have such a fun job. It's so interesting to, I mean, how many people are walking around the world here saying, oh man, I didn't sleep well, slugging their third coffee. Is that what led you to join that particular area of focus?
Yes, so thank you for your question. So actually, my interest in sleep emerged from my clinical work in managing metabolic syndrome and obesity. So I started clinically in a weight loss medicine clinic, working with patients trying to lose weight and maintain a healthy weight. And as part of that comprehensive assessment and intervention process, I often found myself counseling patients about the importance of and contributions of poor sleep to metabolic dysfunction. And as part of that process, I found myself referring a lot of patients for sleep studies, as well as providing some initial sleep coaching. And through that process, I developed this very deep interest in sleep, and thereafter pursued some more formal training in behavioral sleep medicine. And that's how this interest emerged. I'm happy to talk a bit more about the connections between sleep and metabolic health in this podcast or another. But to your point, many people presenting clinically with depression, anxiety, PTSD, or even physical health conditions like chronic pain or metabolic syndrome almost always, not always, but almost always have some sort of co-occurring sleep disturbance. And in fact, many psychiatric conditions, including anxiety and depression, include clinical criteria aimed at assessing sleep. Are you getting enough of it or are you not? So many of our major psychopathologies in some form or fashion have a diagnostic feature of sleep disturbance. And of course, sleep undergirds every psychiatric and physical health process and can maintain a lot of the symptoms if not treated, whether that's chronic pain, whether that's metabolic syndrome, whether that's cognitive issues.
So why is that? Is sleep, in its simplest terms,
Is just a reset button for the brain? I mean, just trying to boil it down so that I can understand why that's the case.
So sleep plays an incredibly important role, not only in resetting our metabolic health, but also our cognitive health. And there are several mechanisms that are at play there, but we have these several stages of sleep that we pass through, unimaginatively stages 1 through 4, and then REM. And we can partition those stages into non-REM, so stages 1 through 4, and REM sleep. And every single process or every single stage of sleep plays an incredibly important role in our sleep health and overall health. So I don't say this to proffer up one stage of sleep as more important than any of the others, but the deepest stages of sleep, particularly stages 3 and 4, we believe play a critical role in producing growth hormone and repairing bodily damage incurred throughout the day. So Matthew Walker often talks about consciousness as low-grade brain damage that sleep helps to restore. So in stages 3 and 4, we see a secretion of growth hormone that helps to repair bodily damage incurred during the day. We see a secretion of cerebral spinal fluid into the brain, and that we believe plays a role in taking out the trash or the sort of neurotoxins that accumulate throughout the day, namely beta amyloid plaque, a plaque implicated in Alzheimer's disease. And so what we find, at least from recent experimental research, is that one night of sleep deprivation, defined as 5 hours, produced a clinically significant increase in beta amyloid plaque in certain regions of the brain implicated in memory. And so what that tells us is not only does sleep play an important restorative role, it plays an incredibly important role in enhancing our cognition by clearing out neurotoxins, and also plays an important role in emotional regulation. Sleep deprivation is associated with an increase in limbic activity, and the limbic system represents our primary emotion and memory center. And when we are sleep deprived, that part of the brain tasked with keeping us safe during periods of distress, during which our survival gets threatened, gets activated. But our frontal lobe and our prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain associated with thinking, memory, logic, and planning, sort of goes offline. And so when we don't get enough sleep, we see an increase in impulsive behavior, emotional dysregulation, and a hijacking of our motivation. And that's just a very brief cross-section of the function of sleep, but it plays an incredibly important role in restoring our physical health, optimizing our cognitive health, and regulating our emotional health. Not to mention all of the positive effects it exerts on our cardiometabolic health, because the relationship between sleep and metabolic functioning is very well established through several mechanisms.
Got it. Oh man, that's so daunting to hear just how one night could take on such a toll physically.
Well, we as part of responsible science and science communication, we want to refrain from catastrophizing or fear-mongering.
Of course, I agree with that. Yeah.
Instead, what we want to do is empower people to understand that sleep, though previously regarded as this unnecessary process, undergirds every facet of our psychological and physical health, and we can control it. It is one of the most valuable, effective, robust, democratic health tools that people have at their disposal. And so, contrary to popular cultural messages that sleep is for the weak or that we'll sleep when we're dead, sleep is one of the most powerful tools that you can use to optimize your health and to prevent further health decline.
I know. People who say sleep when you're dead, it's like,
no, the best drug right now that you could take is 8 hours of sleep.
Yeah, I mean, if we
like a different person.
So two thoughts. So yes, two famed insomniacs, right? Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan both touted that they slept 5 hours or less at night. And again, correlational, not causal, but interesting to note that both went on to develop Alzheimer's disease, which ultimately led their demise. And so again, I share this information not to fearmonger, but instead to empower people to recognize sleep as an incredibly important tool in health, longevity, and wellness that they can control. And if we could put the benefits of sleep and exercise into a pill, right? So increased energy, sex drive, cognitive functioning, emotional regulation, social connectedness, it it would sell overnight.
The fountain of youth. Yeah, absolutely. Well, to your point of wanting to empower people, before we get into dreams and nightmares, what are some of your sleep tips that when an individual accepts, they can then use in their daily lives?
Gosh, I have so many to share.
Okay.
I will start with one, daily regularity. And when I say that, I mean a common myth that has gotten circulated includes this idea that we need to go to bed and wake up at the same time every day. That is only 50% true. We need to wake up at the same time every day. We need to anchor our wake up time. And because humans operate on a roughly 24-hour circadian rhythm, sometimes shorter, sometimes longer, if we wake up at the same time every day, the likelihood that we'll feel sleepy and go to bed around the same time every day increases.
Right.
That isn't to say that you need to go to bed at the same time. The only time you want to go to bed is when you feel sleepy, not tired. And we want to differentiate feeling sleepy from feeling tired. Sleepy or sleepiness refers to the physical inability to stay awake. Your body sends you very clear behavioral cues that it feels sleepy, in the same way your body sends you very clear cues when it feels hungry. Your eyelids are heavy, your head bobs, you feel this drive to sleep. Only then do you go to sleep. Fatigue, on the other hand, or tiredness, refers to a state of physical and mental low energy. And the danger of going to bed when you feel tired instead of sleepy is that you might not actually fall asleep or certainly stay asleep. And that's important because time spent awake in bed morphs the bed into a cue for wakefulness over iterations of pairing the bed with activity rather than for sleep. So when you go to bed only when you feel sleepy, you reduce the likelihood that you'll spend time awake in the bed, which buffers against something called conditioned arousal. And conditioned arousal refers to this idea that the bed has morphed into a cue for activity. To illustrate this concept, many patients will talk about feeling sleepy on their couch or chair. And then as soon as they transition into the bedroom, their eyes pop wide open. That is conditioned arousal because the brain has learned, the bed, this is the place where I worry. This is the place where I scroll through my phone. This is the place where I watch TV.
Oh no,
and,
I'm not going to sleep.
And where you have anxious cognitions and worries. That's right. So backing up, you want to wake up at the same time every day and only go to bed when you feel sleepy, which has very clear behavioral symptoms. That prevents against the development of conditioned arousal, whereby the bed morphs into a cue for activity rather than for sleep. But another really important point here is the body rewards regularity. So people who wake up at the same time every day tend to report improved cognitive, emotional, and physical functioning. For example, people who wake up at the same time every day are actually less likely to go on to develop obesity or insulin resistance. And the reason for that has to do with how physiologically expensive it is for the body to have to reroute every day. And the analogy I like to invoke here is if you've ever driven to work pre-COVID, you probably took the same route to work every day, in part because you had deeply internalized it and you didn't need to think about it. And in not thinking about it, it freed your brain up of cognitive resources. So you could maybe buy a coffee or make your to-do list for the day or listen to some music. But if you had a detour, that probably couldn't happen. You'd probably have to focus and attend more to the rerouting. And it's the same sort of process with your body. When you wake up at the same time every day, your body is not having to do all of that very expensive physiological rerouting that can lead to feelings of grogginess and irritability and cognitive sluggishness. So waking up at the same time every day really provides a very important route to sleep health. I also really like to encourage people to make sure that they get light exposure, natural light exposure throughout the day into the afternoon, light serves as a Zeitgeber or a time giver, and it synchronizes our circadian rhythm, which in very essential terms tells us when to be up or regulates, in part regulates when we are awake and when we are asleep. And so to optimize sleep health, you really want to make sure that you get natural light exposure throughout the day, and then start winding down your face time with light emitting devices and other sources of light 2 to 3 hours before bed, because that can interrupt entry into the deepest stages of sleep when we experience that delicious secretion of growth hormone.
I didn't realize that window of 3 hours could really affect you that long.
And we're still trying to understand exactly how that varies within and across people. But as of right now, yeah, the recommendations are in the range of 1 to 3 hours. People differ in their level of sensitivity, but we know that blue light at or around bedtime can interrupt entry into those deepest stages of sleep. So, and I don't want to pontificate because I know we have other things to talk about, but I do want to mention a few other things. We also want to make sure that we use the bed for two things and for two things only: for sleep and for sex. This isn't to say that you can't have sex in other places, but we want to make sure that the bed is used appropriately, because as we've discussed before, we want to prevent the development of conditioned arousal, which can perpetuate insomnia symptoms. And over iterations of pairing the bed with activity rather than sleep, the bed can morph into a cue for wakefulness, which maintains insomnia symptoms. So what I like to recommend patients do beyond just leaving the bed for sleep and for sex, I encourage patients to get out of bed when they start feeling like falling to sleep or returning to sleep has gotten effortful, anxiety provoking, or frustrating, because we don't want the brain associating the bed with negative activating emotions. And so typically I'll say, get out of the bed after about 15 to 30 minutes, go into another room with the lights off or low, and do something relaxing but not stimulating. And that varies from person to person. That could include a guided relaxation, folding laundry, reading a book, doing a word search. And then when you notice those symptoms of sleepiness return, go back into the bed. And in doing so, you restore the association of the bed with sleep and extinguish the association of the bed with activity. There are a host of other things, but another really important thing includes daytime energy expenditure. So to sleep better at night, get moving during the day. One of the processes that regulates our sleep beyond the circadian drive is the homeostatic sleep drive, and it's kind of like hunger in that the longer you go without sleep, the more that pressure for sleep increases. Kind of like hunger, the longer you go without eating, the hungrier you get. And at the next feeding opportunity, the more you will likely eat. We can help to accumulate that sleep pressure during the day through restricting our time in bed and restricting things like daytime napping, as well as caffeine that can oppose something called adenosine. But in staying active throughout the day, we actually stimulate that compound adenosine, which accumulates throughout the day to induce sleepiness and then actually resets at night, such that when you wake up in the morning, that adenosine level is at its nadir again. Daytime energy expenditure can help to build up that sleep pressure or that sleep hunger that we can sort of cash out later in the day to get us sleeping deeper and quicker.
Great. I just wanted to go back. When you say wake up at the same time every morning, is that the
even on weekends?
Minute? What's that?
I said even on weekends.
Yes. But is that within a 15-minute range, half an hour range?
Yeah. So you don't want there to be so much variability that your body perceives it as a change in time zone.
Okay.
So anything over an hour technically is contraindicated, but I'm very conservative when it comes to this. And I want my patients to, wake up at the same time with a reasonable amount of flexibility. So I feel comfortable with 20-ish minutes, but keeping it as close as possible.
Sounds good. Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that. Moving on to dreams. We're here to talk about nightmares, but I guess we should discuss dreams and their role in sleep and their role in general health before we get to the rotten side of the coin, I guess.
Yeah.
So what are dreams and why do we have them?
Yeah, okay. That's a big question. So
I figured, yeah.
so excellent question. And I think it's important to differentiate the difference between a dream and a nightmare. So let's start with the basics. So a dream is a series of thoughts, images, and sensations that we experience during sleep. A nightmare represents a very specific clinical thing. A nightmare refers to a dysphoric, well-remembered dream that usually involves some sort of effort to avoid threat, to increase our survival, to preserve our security and physical integrity. And nightmare disorder, which represents a real clinical diagnosis that gets made, refers to that repeated occurrence of extended, extremely dysphoric and well-remembered dreams that again involve efforts to avoid threats to survival, security, and physical integrity. And upon awakening, the person rapidly gets reoriented. So when you wake them up, they know that they just had a nightmare, which differs somewhat from something like a night terror or sleepwalking where people don't know that it's happening. And these nightmares feel incredibly distressing, can sometimes cause daytime impairment. So I bring that up because those are different from dreams. Dreams occur every night, and these just refer to that series of thoughts, images, and sensations that we experience during this thing called sleep. And some fun facts about dreams: during a typical lifespan, a person will spend about 6 years total dreaming in about 2 hours each night. But dreams mostly last 5 to 20 minutes. They vary in their length. Most of the time we are unaware that we are dreaming because the part of our brain that helps us to plan and to be logical, the prefrontal cortex, is decreased in its activation. And another interesting thing to note is that we tend to remember our dreams later in the night. And the reason this happens is because the increase in recall appears related to the intensification of the vividness, colors, and emotions of our dreams towards the later end of the evening, in part because the REM period gets longer throughout the night.
Okay. I was going to say, it's not just like some big finale that like, that's what we have to remember. It's like the...
Yes. So REM, again, we have non-REM and we have REM, first occurs after about 90 minutes of falling asleep and then recurs about every 90 minutes, getting longer later into the night. And as that length increases, we also see an intensification of those images, colors, and emotions that may increase our ability to recall them. In terms of why we dream, there are a lot of explanations, and we don't actually understand why we dream. There are a lot of countervailing hypotheses and arguments, and I kind of want to outline just a few, if that works for you.
Really interesting, yeah.
So I want to note again that the exact purpose isn't really known, but we believe that dreams may help to process information, whether that's emotion, memory, both. Many hypotheses have been proposed as to what functions dream may perform, and some argue that dreams serve no particular purpose. In fact, a few researchers, particularly those of the evolutionary school of thought, argue that dreams are sort of epiphenomenon, that they have no adaptive function, that they kind of came along as a free ride on a system that's designed to think and to sleep. But then in the same breath, there are some who argue, well, no, dreams have an adaptive function because they may yield some insight. They may help us to sort of rehearse threatening situations or threatening scenarios in order to prepare for an actual real life threat. But again, so the hypotheses range from they serve no particular purpose, they represent epiphenomenon that came along for the free ride, all the way to dreams serve as a sort of byproduct of a biochemical process that only occurs in sleep. But I'd say that there are probably, as far as I can tell, a few major schools of thought on this. So the psychodynamic school, attributed to Freud and to Jung, who frankly were onto something, argued that dreams served as unconscious wishes to be interpreted. And a la Freud, dreams are driven by unconscious wish fulfillments. And he called dreams the royal road to the unconscious. And in Freud's interpretation of dreams, he said that all dreams had two levels. They had latent content and they had manifest content. And latent content refers to those deeper unconscious wishes or fantasies, and manifest content, that superficial, sort of meaningless representation of the latent content. So an example might be, maybe you have a dream of a cheeseburger, and the manifest content is the actual burger, but the latent content is your preoccupation with weight and shape. So while it's very difficult to falsify this hypothesis about dreams, many people tend to default to this explanation of dreaming. Said differently, many people, when you ask them, and actually there was a study that found that most people find that their dreams reveal meaningful and hidden truths. And I believe it was one study that was actually conducted here in South Korea and in India, found that 74% of, I believe, people in India, 65% of people in South Korea, and 56% of Americans believe that their dream content provided them with meaningful insight into their unconscious beliefs and desires. So even though this psychodynamic perspective of dreaming lacks falsifiability and, validity, people tend to default to this explanation, which may explain why people get so defensive or anxious when they have a dream about another partner or another person who isn't their primary partner.
Yeah. It's just like breaking down literature or a movie. I see the fun in that, right? It's easy for me to connect with people who think that way.
Sure, and many artists, current and historical, have pointed to their dreams as a source of fodder for many of their creations. So, but from a psychodynamic perspective, the idea is that dreams provide content and insight into the unconscious. Freud described dreams as the royal road to unconscious that provides fodder for additional interpretation that you could bring into your waking life. But I think a more modern, albeit contested, explanation for dreams has to do with something called activation synthesis. And this essentially says that the same structures that induce REM sleep, so where we experience dreams, though I should note, we can also experience dreams in non-REM sleep, though most of our dreams occur in REM, generate sensory information. And this sensory information gets interpreted as dreams, right? So circuits activated in the brainstem during REM sleep send messages to the limbic system, as I've mentioned before, our primary emotion and memory center, because it houses something called our amygdala and hippocampus. And this limbic system gets activated, which initiates the synthesis of neural signals. And because our brain is always trying to make sense, the activation synthesis hypothesis argues that these neural signals get formed into a narrative. So again, this idea that we have these neurochemical signals that are activated and then get filtered into the limbic system and to the frontal lobe to help create meaningful, coherent narrative. Clinically, dreams can sometimes provide very useful context in recovering from trauma. Oftentimes I'll tell patients that the brain has made a very smart choice to experience nightmares after a trauma, because traumatic dreams can perhaps serve to function as a way of emotionally adapting to a very salient or scary event. And reliving the trauma in your dreams when you can no longer actually be physically harmed helps the patient to relive the experience and potentially collect important details that might be meaningful to the survivor in a clinical context and for further emotional processing.
What do you mean? The right choice was made here, or?
Your body is just always trying to achieve homeostasis. It is always trying to do what it needs to do to optimize its functioning and survival. And so when you have a trauma, what does the body do with that energy? What does the body do with that content? How does it use it? And one argument might be, well, it uses it in dreams to help make meaning out of what happened and to also provide additional insight into the meaning and the experience itself. And there's some evidence to support that, particularly because we know that sleep itself plays an incredibly important role in consolidating our memories. And so in the process of dreaming, perhaps the brain is trying to sort of take out some of the emotional trash, but also help to make more salient the important pieces of information.
That's so beautiful to think that what people describe as something that's ailing them could potentially put them on the path to feeling better.
Yeah, and if not, yes, if not on a physiological level, certainly on a psychological one, particularly if people experience recurrent nightmares. Recurrent nightmares can motivate people to enter into behavioral treatment for the reduction, not only of those nightmares, but perhaps for the co-occurring traumatic symptoms. So yes, it certainly provides perhaps an organic way of healing thyself, but can also motivate people to seek out additional treatment.
Absolutely.
I remember the stress I felt having to switch from Final Cut Pro to Premiere. They're both video editing software. It can be daunting to switch or have to continuously learn a new program. In fact, I learned Premiere by telling a company that I knew Premiere when I didn't. And I just figured it out and really threw myself into the pool to make sure I knew it because I knew I needed to know it. So learning software is very important, especially if you lied and need to catch up. Today's episode is brought to you by My Software Tutor. Are your Excel skills optimized for your current job? Do you know the basics but need to learn more? My Software Tutor offers 3 levels of real-time Zoom-based courses with a live instructor. Yeah, I need a live instructor. There's a lot of video tutorials out there, but having someone ask questions feels a lot better, a lot easier. They all deliver practical, functional business skills in a friendly, supportive environment. These courses will increase your marketability, whether you're an employee, job seeker, consultant, or contractor. Register at mysoftwaretutor.com and use the promo code POD20 to save 20% off all registrations. Today's episode is also brought to you by The Cardist. This is a service that basically helps you mail cards with a special message on the inside. They help you write that. That's amazing because Jamie's always laughing at me because I usually just write the person's name, Dear so-and-so, and then at the end just write love, Pat and Jamie. Just when you get to writing the card, you feel so put on the spot. I'm pretty expressive with how I feel in my relationship with my friends or with my family. So yeah, it's also hilarious to be admitting that I feel like I'm really put on the spot and couldn't think of anything to say. 8 years of improv training down the drain. But with so many birthdays, there's no time to shop for cards, write the cards, and buy the stamps. Now you can do it all right where you sit, because the Cardist Studio does it for you. That's great. I want more things where people do it for you. Make your life easier. Introducing a writing specialist for the message inside your greeting cards. The Cardist Studio creates your message, writes it in the card, and mails it for you. The post office... One tough thing when I used to live in Brooklyn was the lines at the post office. Insane. South Carolina, it's just, you walk right in, you walk right out. The most recent man who helped me was like smiling at me. I'm so used to the post office just being like, get out of here. We have more people to get in. Just see the line, hurry up. All you do is pick the card and tell why you're sending it. No more errands, no more anxiety. For a message from your heart, but not your hands. Sit back and just enjoy your relationships. thecartastudio.com. Thoughtful just got easy. And you can use the promo code ANXIETYPOD for 10% off all orders.
Okay, so we started dipping into nightmares. I was very interested to hear you describing separating nightmares almost. Was I hearing that correctly? Where like you were describing what dreams are and their function and
Yeah, and I want to pause to differentiate a dream from a nightmare and nightmare disorder. Those are three separate things that have clinical and practical utility. So a dream, non-controversial, just represents or is a series of thoughts, images, and sensations experienced during sleep. We tend to experience most of our dreams during REM, but we can also experience dreams during the other stages of sleep previously mentioned. And I should note that we spend about 75% of our time in non-REM, so stages 1 through 4, and about 25% of our time in REM. So that's what a dream is. What's the difference between a dream and a nightmare? Well, a nightmare is this extremely dysphoric, well-remembered dream that usually involves, but not always, but usually involves some sort of effort to avoid threat, to avoid threats to survival, security, or physical integrity that tends to occur during the second half of our major sleep episode. So that's the difference. A dream is not something that you necessarily remember. It is not dysphoric, and it typically doesn't wake you up. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
The difference here is the dream dysphoric? Is it scary? Does it threaten your survival in some way? And so if you've ever had a nightmare, you might reflect on the content of that. And almost always it involves someone trying to kill you or someone, chasing after you, or for many veterans, entering a combat situation, or mothers losing their children, or pregnant women losing their baby. Again, the emphasis on dysphoric and disturbing. It becomes a disorder when there are certain criteria met. And there's something called nightmare disorder, and it's actually fairly prevalent among combat veterans, though the baseline prevalence of nightmare disorder is fairly low, about 1 or 2% of the population. It becomes a disorder when these dysphoric dreams or nightmares recur. So they happen a lot. If upon waking, the person becomes rapidly oriented and alert, but most importantly, if the nightmares start to cause distress and impairment in waking life, meaning do these nightmares bother the individual during the day, during their waking hours? Is it interfering with their ability to do their work, to engage in their relationships, to feel safe, to feel euphoric or positive emotion? So from a clinical perspective, to answer your question of spectrum, the content, the frequency, okay, maybe, those matter, but the things that really matter are the subjective experiences of distress and impairment. Okay. And as soon as you start feeling like it's affecting what you need and want to do and your emotional functioning during waking life, that's when we perhaps have a compelling clinical issue to address.
Right. Oh my gosh. My heart goes out to people who are experiencing that. That just sounds so distressing.
Yeah. And it's sometimes a symptom of something else like PTSD, right? But sometimes it's just a standalone experience where it doesn't co-occur in the context of another disorder. It can just present as itself. And I think it's important to note that a nightmare is different from a night terror, right? I think people sometimes confuse those as well. What they have in common is that they're all parasomnias, right? So a parasomnia is any abnormal behavior or experience or psychological event that occurs in association with sleep or sleep-specific stages or sleep-wake transitions. And sleepwalking and night terrors are two very common parasomnias. Sleepwalking, as the name implies, describes these repeated episodes of rising from bed and walking about. And a haunting hallmark of this includes the blank staring face that many people have while they're doing this, and really being relatively unresponsive and only awakened with great difficulty. A night terror, on the other hand, it refers to these sort of recurrent episodes of abrupt terror arousals from sleep, usually beginning with some kind of panicky scream. And people experience intense fear and signs of arousal, so rapid breathing and sweating. But unlike with a nightmare or nightmare disorder, they don't remember the dream. And amnesia of the episode of the actual night terror is present. So I just wanted to differentiate those things because sometimes they get used interchangeably.
Yeah.
And sorry, Patrick, but another common parasomnia, which can co-occur with nightmare disorder, is something called rapid eye movement or REM behavior disorder, where people actually act out their dreams. So normal sleepers experience something called atonia, essentially loss of muscle tone, which has an adaptive value because we get flagrantly psychotic in our dreams. And atonia provides a way of ensuring that we don't act out that flagrant psychosis. But some people don't experience that atonia and therefore experience something called REM without atonia, or REM behavior sleep disorder, whereby people will do things in their sleep like kick or punch or sometimes even kill people. So when that atonia doesn't happen, some people may experience REM behavior disorder, whereby they act out their sometimes violent nightmares. And for this reason, we sometimes have to coach patients into making their bedroom safe, particularly combat veterans who may keep firearms or other weapons in their sleeping space.
Yeah. Oh man, that's crazy.
People fall out of bed, people punch their spouses, and sometimes this can trigger something called sleep divorce, where people start sleeping in separate beds just for safety reasons.
Oh, wow. Well, yeah, if that's occurring, that definitely seems like a smart idea. So other than, a traumatic incident, or are there certain things, behaviors that lead to more nightmares?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So what we know, and there are a bunch of things that can lead to nightmares. One is stress.
Okay.
And
yeah. I mean, especially during COVID times, I know a lot of people are talking about that.
Yes. So, and I'll revisit that in a moment, but stress certainly can contribute to nightmares. Sleep deprivation can contribute to lucid dreaming or nightmares. Alcohol, drug use, these things can contribute to nightmares. Sometimes it can be a consequence of a new medication or a new treatment of some kind. There are also genetic predispositions to nightmare and nightmare disorder, exposure to trauma, as we've mentioned. And we also know that age is a contributor. So we know that in general, younger people tend to experience nightmares more frequently than older people, in large part because we tend to spend less time in REM as we age.
Okay.
But yeah, in summary, and by no means is this an exhaustive list, but age, substances like alcohol and drugs, stress, traumatic exposure, as well as certain medical diagnoses can also contribute to nightmares. But people, as you know, have started experiencing or reporting that they've experienced more nightmares and just weird dreams during COVID.
Right, yeah.
And I think there are a few good explanations for this. So in this time of heightened stress, the limbic system, again, our brain's primary emotion and memory center, has more demands to process. And because our brain likes order, it really attempts to digest and integrate all of that stimulation. Our thoughts, our stressors, our experiences, 24-hour news into narratives. Right. And I think a lot of the colorful and strange dreams combined with these changes in our daily routine, so sleeping later or longer, increased alcohol or drug use, and sleep patterns reflect this sort of strong negative emotions that COVID has invited. And for this reason, some patients have shared experiencing dreams or nightmares of escape, of avoidance, of vulnerability. So either getting really small or really large, gaining some superpower like running really fast or flying, or showing up to things naked, which from a psychodynamic perspective represents perhaps one of the most vulnerable things that we could do as a human being.
Yeah.
And so all of this makes sense given the emotional climate of things, but there are other explanations for this too beyond just the emotional demands placed upon our limbic system. Most people have started waking up later, right, in this era of working from home. And because our REM periods tend to last longer and get more intense as we get closer to morning, this allows more time for dreaming. So the increase in total sleep time, or just sleeping in later, kind of lets us stay in the movie a bit longer. But another reason has to do with actually the opposite. So difficulties falling or staying asleep due to worry, right? And there are a lot of worries that we have right now, can decrease our total sleep time. And a shorter sleep duration may restrict our REM sleep. However, this increases our hunger or our pressure for REM later, such that at the next sleep opportunity, you might rebound into REM, which means that the next time you sleep during this REM rebound, dreams can often feel much more vivid, intense, and emotionally charged. So I'd say that a combination of increased stress, changes in daily routine and sleep time, as well as an increase perhaps in suboptimal health behaviors like substance use, plus traumatic exposure, particularly if you identify as a frontline worker, may explain why we've seen these increased reports of nightmares and strange dreams.
You mentioned people citing certain examples, getting big, getting small, showing up places without any clothes on. Does that lend itself, you think, to what you're saying about Freud, where you're analyzing the content and like the underlying layer of the content to have meaning?
It certainly aligns with that possibility, but a skeptic could say this just represents random byproducts of neural activity. And I truly think we don't have to pick our explanation.
Okay.
We can, from a clinical perspective, we want to provide an explanation that helps the person experience their suffering in a meaningful and useful way. So if a psychodynamic interpretation facilitates that and eases suffering, in my opinion, I say, okay, because you could easily see how dismissing that as a neural byproduct could in some ways re-traumatize a person.
Yeah. And I mean, oh, sorry, I don't want to cut you off.
No, go ahead, please. Say what you're going to say.
So I'm not a scientist. I'm a journalist who likes to have discussions about science. So correct this thought, but it's almost like if someone is experiencing something and it's real to them, it is then real.
Clinical psychology dwells in the place of the subjectivity.
Mm-hmm.
And so if something causes someone distress or impairment, those are subjective measures.
Yeah.
I can't give you a blood test to measure the amount of impairment and distress that you have.
Right.
I can give you some validated measures that perhaps tap the construct of interest to help proxy your experience of distress or impairment, but I can't measure the physical amount of that.
Right.
In the same way that I could the burden of a tumor.
Mm-hmm.
And so much of our clinical work depends precisely on the subjective experience of the thing. How much distress does this nightmare cause you? How impairing does that feel for you? And if it feels, which is inherently subjective, if it feels distressing, if it feels impairing, yes, then that is a real thing for you.
Right.
And now, we can corroborate that by doing collateral interviews with other family members, and we can supplement that with validated measures to get a more complete picture of what that distress and impairment looks like. But yes, insomnia, nightmares, these rely on quote unquote subjective experiences and measures. There are certain things that we can objectively measure using polysomnography. So, how much time you spend in a certain stage of sleep, how your sleep architecture looks, how long it takes for you to fall asleep, how many awakenings you have. But these objective and subjective tools aren't antithetical, they're complementary. We need both, particularly in the context of insomnia and other sleep disorders, to create a comprehensive clinical conceptualization and treatment plan. But we don't always need both, particularly in the context of something like nightmare disorder. One, because we don't have an objective measure of nightmare, but two, because it doesn't really matter. What matters is the subjective experience of the nightmare, of pain, of insomnia, of anxiety. Insert thing here.
Yeah, might as well use all the tools at your disposal to help ease suffering.
Correct. So yes, there are certain times when I think a psychodynamic perspective lends itself better than others, but not always. It depends on the needs of the patient, and it depends on the data you have available.
Got it. Sometimes when I have nightmares and in succession,
Let's say I feel like I've had a few in a night, I haven't slept. I feel like I haven't slept when I woke up. Is that because I'm just jolting out of REM sleep and maybe struggling to go back in? Or what would you say is the explanation?
So difficult to know exactly. Difficult to know, for example, the factors that may have interfered with your ability to enter the deepest stages of sleep, stages 3 and 4. So for example, if you consumed a lot of light or blue light before bed, perhaps a better explanation for your fatigue has nothing to do with the nightmare, but more to do with not getting into that restorative stage. That said, nightmares, like any state of prolonged or even acute distress, is very physiologically, psychologically, and cognitively expensive. Okay. So that limbic system is getting activated, and when that gets activated, it's telling the HPA axis, this pathway that secretes cortisol and adrenaline and stress hormones, to get activated also. And that downstream production of those stress hormones can cause those arousal symptoms of heart palpitation, feeling too hot or too cold, physical tension, sometimes derealization, depersonalization, brain fog, because that is a huge jolt of chemistry to the system. And that is very, very expensive, certainly acutely, but and in the long run. So it's part of the reason why acute stress, prolonged stress response via the HPA axis has associations with insulin resistance and obesity and anxiety and depression, because your stress hormones are just totally maxed out.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's very interesting perspective.
A major point of this podcast is to demystify certain things that we're fearful, or I'm stretching the word anxiety to include phobias and yada yada. So I like to give people tools to make things seem a little less scary. So as it relates to nightmares, what would your recommendations be to eliminating nightmares and the stress that they cause to help people live a better life?
So there are a few things that people can do for managing nightmares. Again, I want to go back to my original point. If we all at some point have experienced a nightmare, right? And again, one might make the argument that that has some sort of survival benefit or emotional benefit. You may want to consider clinical intervention when you notice an increase in the number of those disturbing nightmares and dreams. If those nightmares and dreams start to cause distress, meaning they bother you in your waking life, and impairment, meaning they get in the way of doing the things that you want to do and need to do. So how does that look? Well, you want to seek out a behavioral sleep medicine provider. Some psychologists, clinical psychologists and social workers may have experience in that, but you'll increase your chances of evidence-based treatment provision in seeking out someone who specializes in behavioral sleep medicine. The reason is most people who specialize in behavioral sleep medicine get training in something called imagery rehearsal therapy, or IRT. And IRT is a very brief, time-limited, evidence-based intervention that helps people to manage and hopefully eliminate their nightmares. And this treatment involves learning relaxation skills, to practice before bed, eliciting a target nightmare, so the nightmare that tends to recur the most frequently and cause the most distress, and then to work with a provider to rescript, to change the outcome of the nightmare, and then to practice that new nightmare over time and pairing it with relaxation such that you reduce, hopefully, the frequency and the intensity of the original target nightmare, and in the best case scenario, eliminate it entirely, and in the process, reduce the downstream and upstream impairments you see psychologically and functionally.
So that would be something like, I'm reliving a nightmare
where I'm in combat, and through this RIT training, you would use some sort of down regulation. Like I talked to a person, a psychologist, who focused on anxiety related to planes. And
Yep.
he said to pair, similar to what you're describing, except when something would make you anxious, think of something like a time you were petting your dog or your mom's whispering
Yeah.
to you. Yeah. So is that what you're describing essentially?
So in the context of a phobia, the evidence-based recommendation is something called graduated exposure. So if you were afraid of a plane, maybe we would start by showing you a picture of a plane and then a video of a plane, and then maybe we would eventually get you onto a plane after your subjective units of distress decrease over time. That's habituation. With imagery rehearsal therapy, an example might be, and this was a real example from a clinical case, I had a veteran who had the same nightmare every night, like clockwork, and it involved him reliving an explosion that ejected him out of his car and caused concussion. And when he was describing the dream, he mentioned that he was driving down a road, and when he turned right, he drove into the landmine that exploded. And so what we did as part of the rescripting protocol was rewrite the dream such that instead of turning, did I just say right? He turned in the opposite direction. He turned to the other side of the road to prevent the traumatic event from occurring. So he turned in the opposite direction, and we scripted out him instead stopping for lunch at a local diner. We described what he ate, what it smelled like, the waitress, what she looked like, what he was thinking, what he was feeling, what he was seeing, tasting, sensing, and we rescripted it with such high resolution detail that it eventually knocked out the old nightmare. So over time, he identified the target nightmare. Together, we rewrote it with extreme detail, really capitalizing on all these sensory experiences. Over treatment, had him practice that new nightmare and then practice relaxation in the morning, the afternoon, and the evening. And over, a few sessions, he reported reductions in the frequency of that nightmare and less impairment.
Wonderful. That's so wonderful that that's even possible. It's something
That waking up today, or even an hour ago, I didn't think that was something that we can do. That's so
imagery rehearsal therapy. And so that is indicated for people who have clinically significant nightmares. Now, if you want to prevent nightmares or just odd dreams, again, it goes back to really making sure that you're waking up at the same time, not having an irregular sleep schedule, managing stress, really curbing the use of alcohol and drugs, particularly close to bedtime, and making sure you're doing those other daytime activities that optimize your sleep, including exercising and managing exposure to blue light throughout the day. And then also, making sure that your attitudes and beliefs and cognitions about sleep are helpful. Many people find sleep an incredibly anxiety-provoking thing because it feels performative. They feel like if they can't do it, then something bad will happen. So working to identify some of the cognitions you may have about sleep that work against you can help to prevent some anxiety.
Great. This has been so interesting. I feel like we can talk about this for hours.
Thank you so much for your time. I just want to double check. Did I miss anything? Is there anything you'd you'd like to mention?
Oh man, I think we need to do a separate podcast about things that people can do to optimize their sleep. I really provided a very limited cross section of things, but there is a catalog of things that people can do beyond the ones that I've mentioned. I also want to note that if you do find yourself experiencing nightmares or insomnia symptoms, these are manageable. These can get better. Treating sleep is a very good way of also treating your mental health, because your sleep and your mental health go hand in hand. And so if you feel reluctant about pursuing traditional psychotherapy for something like anxiety or depression or trauma, consider starting with treating your sleep, because that will have, again, these upstream and downstream consequences for your psychological functioning, but may also help to expose you to the process of therapy in a way that helps to perhaps challenge some of the stigmas and preconceptions you have about it.
Great point.
So using sleep treatment not only as an entryway into optimizing your own mental health, but also as an entryway into exposing yourself to the process of therapy can really help, particularly because the evidence-based treatments for sleep and sleep disorders, including cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia or CBTI, tend to be relatively brief and high yield, meaning that people get better and get better very quickly.
That's great news. Christina, thank you so much for your time, and
We'll talk again soon.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Got it.
It's wild how important sleep is. I mean, it kind of sounds obvious, but it's also not. I don't know. There's a bit of throughout my life personally, I've had a bit of FOMO and got another beer at another bar, or stayed out later, or just disregarded sleep to do this or that. But now, maybe it's because I'm now 35, but I'm trying to take my sleep a little bit more seriously, and I hope you do too. Because oh boy, having a nice sippable whiskey feels great, as one of my drugs of choice. But getting 8 hours of sleep, oh girl. It's so much better. It's incredible. You wake up feeling like a new person, like you can do anything that you need to do. Well, thank you again to the doctor. Thank you for listening. Before I close out this season, the second season of That Gives Me Anxiety, I wanted to give you another Anxiety Hall of Fame. And I'm choosing Cameron from Ferris Bueller's Day Out. What a rule follower. I mean, I guess it's a good friendship that they had, where Ferris was all about breaking the rules and Cameron was grounded and could use the day out, right? Could use a little rule breaking. Just nervous about everything. I mean, certainly plenty of things in that movie for him to be anxious about, including his relationship with his father, right? But the fact that he wore a Gordie Howe Red Wings jersey through the whole thing, it tells me there's somebody in there that wants to improve their relationship with anxiety, to just be relaxed and wearing a hockey jersey. So yeah, Cameron Fry is in the Anxiety Hall of Fame. Well, I truly mean this. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening, giving the show a chance. I'd love any help in promoting the show, telling a friend about it. That really can go a long way. All right. Well, I hope you if you haven't already, give Death Space Filling the Void a chance during its third season. You can go back and listen to the prior 2 seasons. And this podcast will be back in a couple weeks with at least 10 more episodes. So plenty to look forward to. So thank you again, and I'll talk to you soon.